I have this thing where I'm gay and I share it on the internet. Just when I thought I'd consumed all the Sapphic Dianna Agron content in existence, I discovered more. She cannot be stopped, and I don't want her to stop. At this point, she's made more Sapphic content than I have, and that makes her competition. I mean, it's a competition that she's already won because she's Dianna Agron and I'm not. She looks like she was carved out of marble from ancient Greece by Aphrodite, and I look like a Victorian child who's about to perish from tuberculosis. It's not called looking for compliments, it's called the ugly truth. So, honestly, even in this wig, with respect and full consent, I would take her out to a bookstore and buy her a hot drink. I would. It works for me. To be honest, I feel like if you want to ask Dianna Agron out on a date, it needs to be to an obscure cafe in Paris. I don't know, that's just the vibes I get, you know? She's a Taurus. Science, baby. Now, this video is a weird one because during my research for this film and this review, I stumbled across some early 20th century Sapphic tea, which I had not seen anyone else discuss before. My kink. Yes, I fell down the rabbit hole. Insert lesbian Taylor Swift joke here. There is no escape from Taylor Swift's lesbian activity. Oh god, there's no escape. So, as it turns out, thirsting over Dianna Agron can be educational. Who knew? Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video I'm just going to be reviewing the 2021 film The Laureate. As a disclaimer, The Laureate does have a Sapphic element to it, that's why I'm sat here. But it's not a Sapphic love story, and in fact, I would describe this film as a heterosexual polyamorous situationship of sorts. Even though this film is supposed to be a biopic of a man who was well documented as a bisexual in real life, but we'll get to that later. Oh, we'll get to that later. So, to my fellow Sapphic women, lower your expectations. If you're not familiar with The Laureate, it's a biographical film about celebrated poet and writer Robert Graves, who returns from war traumatized and struggling to find his creativity. It takes young poet Laura Riding to reignite Robert's passion. With the blessing of wife Nancy, his muse becomes his lover. With the three of them sharing a life, Laura's attention soon turns to Nancy, and their complicated relationship threatens to risk everything they have. And of course, this video will contain spoilers. You have not seen the film, you have been warned. Couples introducing a third. They always insist everything is fine, but it always ends in tears. I mean, I cry without the numerous lovers, so who has the better end of the deal here really? It's not I, ladies and gentlemen, it's not I. And on that note, let's get into it. Okay, so on both an artistic and a technical level, The Laureate is a mixed bag. On the one hand, I did find this film very aesthetically pleasing. There's some gorgeous mise en scène, and I thought for the most part that the film managed to recreate 1920s England fairly well. There's also some really interesting artistic choices which enhance characterization and tone in certain scenes. For example, there's one scene where Laura Riding is sneaking around World's End with a candle, and she looks almost spectral, which I thought was a very interesting visual choice. That can be interpreted as representative of her haunted mental state and suggestive of her presence in the house as an omen, potentially in relation to the death of Robert Graves' relationship with his wife. On the other hand, throughout much of this film, the cinematography generally felt uninspired, and the editing was also quite jarring, especially near the beginning. There was just too much too soon being pushed on the audience. And in certain places, the film was reminiscent of a TikTok video. However, it does eventually settle into a much more measured pace, so the questionable editing is an issue, but not one which persists throughout the entire entire production. I think for the most part, the Laureate does a good job of showcasing Robert Graves' work, and his poetry is thoughtfully integrated throughout the film. However, we definitely got a better sense of his work than we did of him, which for a biopic isn't ideal, I should say.
I'm not sure if it was more Tom Hughes' wooden acting or William Nunez's misguided writing.
Or a combination of both that's to blame for the diminished and weak depiction of Robert Graves in this film. From what I've researched about Robert Graves, he's described as a deeply complex, sentimental bisexual man who had been left traumatized by the immense horrors of war and spent his whole life navigating his sexuality and relationships in an incredibly homophobic society. And with the one exception of the war flashbacks and the portrayal of his PTSD, none of those aspects of his character were really reflected in the film. The Laureate also focuses on the character of Laura Riding just as much as it does Robert Graves. And similar to Graves, Riding was a very complex and layered person in real life. Through Riding, the film does lightly touch upon the sexism that female writers faced in 1920s British literary circles. But to be honest, the portrayal of Riding's struggles with sexism and her Jewish identity, particularly within the context of that time period, felt more like lip service within a couple of throwaway lines than it did a genuine attempt to show Riding's experiences with society and her sense of self. For example, in my research, I discovered that Laura Riding didn't actually write any poetry about Judaism or her Jewish roots, except for one piece titled Jews. And this piece reads to me as though she actually had quite a complicated, negative even, relationship with that aspect of herself. And I realise the film is not a Laura Riding biopic, but she was a huge part of Robert Graves' life, and she was also placed at the centre of this film alongside him. So I do think she could have been portrayed in a more thoughtful way, because much like Robert Graves, the Laura Riding I read about in my research was really not reflected in this film at all. On top of that, apart from the ghostly visuals I was discussing earlier, we never really get a sense of Riding's ongoing fragile mental state. She is framed as being more vindictive, seductive, and temperamental than she is as suffering from poor mental health. It just seemed to me that William Nunez was not interested in reflecting any of the people that this film is based upon through his characters, and instead was more interested in just projecting his own ideas and biases onto them. I mean, a quick Google search of either Laura Riding or Robert Graves will show you that immediately.
Despite the reductive writing, I do feel that Dianna Agron
still managed to bring a layer of depth and nuance in her portrayal of Riding. I think it helps that Dianna Agron is naturally quite introspective, so she can always just fall back on that in her acting, and it works. It was also observable that she was really trying to elicit a connection with the weaker actors in this film, but ultimately her attempts felt very one-sided.
And I have to say, the cast for this film are all incredibly beautiful, but I'm not sure any of them were quite right for their roles. Tom Hughes and Laura Haddock's performances in particular felt really flat and disengaged, especially in contrast to Dianna Agron and Fra Fee. And
it looked to me as though most of the actors in this film were consistently uncomfortable, both by themselves and interacting with each other,
which didn't really do a film that centres around a highly passionate and tumultuous ménage à quatre any favours.
It did not. In terms of the film's sapphic elements, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised that Nancy and Laura came together no pun intended, before Robert and Laura did. That's unprecedented in these types of films. Usually there's always a heterosexual connection established first. I mean, you even get that in some lesbian films, so that was kind of refreshing, to be honest. And I have to say, for a film with a male director, I thought the romantic scene between Nancy and Laura was actually very tasteful. Stop the presses! And I appreciated how their connection was thoughtfully intertwined with Nancy's artistic work. It was Titanic-esque almost. And like I said, this film is very visually beautiful in places, and this is one of those places. I will always appreciate Dianna Agron committing lesbian crimes. I will always appreciate that. Insert Lady Gaga meme forever. And I'm very grateful this scene exists. Truly, I am. However, for context in relation to what I'm about to say, I should add here that in the research I did for this film, I couldn't find any substantial evidence that Laura and Nancy had actually had any kind of physical affair. It's well documented that they lived together alongside Robert and that Laura and Robert established a romantic relationship. But as far as I could see, there was nothing about Nancy and Laura doing the same, which means that romantic scene was potentially, and I say potentially because perhaps William Nunez has access to historical records or literature that I don't, a fictional embellishment, which is totally fine, but the Sapphic element being immediately neglected right after that one initial connection felt very confusing and odd. The next and only other time Laura and Nancy's connection is touched upon is when Laura tells Nancy she isn't that way, even though she was very clearly established in that way. So it was a purposeful choice of William Nunez to negate the Sapphic relationship outside of a single sexual encounter in the Laureate. And it's reminiscent of bisexual fetishism, where bisexual women are reduced to a sexual experience, which is perceived as being beneficial or entertaining for men and therefore palatable and interesting. But their actual relationships with other women outside of that are either ignored or shunned because they're not. And now this is where the potential historic Sapphic tea comes into play. Because what's interesting is that in my research into Laura Riding and Nancy Nicholson's relationship, I discovered that Laura Riding actually developed quite an intense correspondence with Gertrude Stein. And for those who don't know, Gertrude Stein is a Jewish American author and a lesbian who famously had a romantic relationship with Alice B. Toklas in the early 20th century. And from Riding and Stein's written correspondence, it's observable that they had both a professional and personal influence on each other's lives. In Gertrude Stein, Laura Riding and the Space of Letters, Logan Esdale writes, "The two writers were friends from 1927 to 1930, but their relationship has received little attention. In particular, nobody has yet analysed the two Everybody's books together. The Everybody's books that are referred to here are Riding's book Everybody's Letters, published in 1933, and Stein's book Everybody's Autobiography, published in 1937. So from those titles alone, you can already draw up a connection there between the two. And really, those titles are the tip of the iceberg in what is a very layered and tumultuous connection that they shared. Logan Esdale has also actually published a collection of letters between Riding and Stein, in which he describes their relationship as one that starts impersonally, even transactionally, but becomes intensely personal. Now, I haven't actually read these letters yet, but from what I've uncovered in my research so far, there's no hard evidence that Riding and Stein actually had any kind of physical affair. However, there is sufficient evidence that their connection and influence on each other was so strong that it significantly shaped both of their works and continued to do so even after their relationship had ended. So I do think that there is a potential Sapphic connection there that has been overlooked or perhaps even overshadowed by Stein's relationship with Alice B. Toklas.
And I'm excited to see what I uncover with further research. Historians will say they were good friends, but the Sapphic underground will say they were lovers. Anyway, it is very interesting, but I don't want to go into it too much more here because this is a film review. So taking this information and circling back to the review, it is disappointing that the Riding-Stein relationship was completely omitted from the film, despite the impact that Stein had on Riding's life. And it's also disappointing that the opportunity to highlight a lesser known part of Sapphic history and explore the complexities of those Sapphic relationships within that period through the character of Riding was also missed, with Nunes instead reducing that aspect of Riding's character down to one meaningless encounter. But even worse than the strange Sapphic element in the Laureate is that William Nunes completely erases Robert Graves' bisexuality, which was, unlike with Laura Riding's sexuality, very well documented in real life. There's substantial evidence which points to Graves being bisexual, having had same-sex relationships, and having had a lot of internalized homophobia, and in a turmoil with navigating that part of himself in a period where homosexuality was illegal. That would have been a really interesting aspect of his character to explore in the film, and it was undeniably a huge part of his life, so for that to be completely ignored, whilst an apparently meaningless sexual encounter between two women was included, is just cowardly and highlights the director's bias. And for a film made in 2021, there's not really an excuse for that kind of bisexual erasure. But really, everything in this film, from sexism to sexuality, was either diminished or adulterated. And ultimately, William Nunes was not interested in who the people he wrote a film about truly were. It's like he took everything interesting about Robert Graves and Laura Riding, discarded it, and presented us with the leftover shell. He really did produce quite a spineless piece of cinema.
Overall, the Laureate is a production which contains little to no substance, and as a biopic of Robert Graves, it massively misses the mark. That said, it's not the worst film that I've ever seen, and it does have some redeeming visual qualities, namely Dianna Agron kissing another woman. And if you're a fan of Dianna Agron, I do think this film is worth watching for her performance and the 30 seconds of Sapphic activity which takes place, which were the best 30 seconds of my life. And if you're like me and you have a penchant for 1920s fashion, this film does provide some good inspiration, so there you go. Just a shame about that gosh darn bisexual erasure. Kids, huh? Okay guys, if you've seen the Laureate, let me know what you thought of it down in the comments section below. Give me some sugar. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.